The battle begins. RAAF aircraft were the first Australians to engage with the Japanese and were crucial to the early warning of invasion that the Malayan defenders had. As previously noted, the British had developed an extensive network of airfields in northern Malaya. 3 of the 4 RAAF squadrons were located in central and northern Malaya. Number 1 Squadron was at Kota Baru, 21 Squadron Flying Fighters was at Sungai Petani, and 8 Squadron was at Kuantan. 2 days prior to the invasion, RAAF Hudsons detected a Japanese convoy off Cape Cambodia. This added to a picture already emerging from other intelligence sources. The evening before the invasion, an RAAF aircraft detected Japanese ships off the Thai coast near Singora and steaming south towards Patani and Kota Baru in Malaya. The RAAF reconnaissance efforts had assisted in making the British Far East Command at least ready to respond to a Japanese attack, something that was not to happen less than a day later in the Philippines, where US General Douglas MacArthur's command failed to be prepared for devastating Japanese air attacks, even though Thailand, Malaya and Hawaii had by then all been subject to attack. The Japanese invasion came in the form of simultaneous landings on the east coast of Thailand and 1 landing site in Malaya at Kota Baru. At 12:25 a.m. on Monday the 8th of December 1941, troops from the Japanese 5th Division of the 25th Army came ashore near Kota Baru in Malaya. Their arrival was reported to commanders in Singapore, and they were engaged on the ground by troops of the 9th Indian Division. Air attacks on the invasion force were in turn ordered by Headquarters Far East Command. Australia's first contribution to the Malaya campaign was by Number 1 Squadron RAAF. It's appropriate to start a description of the Malaya campaign by focusing on the air forces. This is because, as mentioned earlier, improvements in aircraft technology and the inability to field strong naval forces made many consider the aircraft the first line of defence for Malaya. To summarise the official history, at 8 minutes past 2 a.m, in clearing weather with a rising moon, the 1st Hudson from Number 1 Squadron took off, followed at intervals of only 2 or 3 minutes by 6 more. Because of the nearness of the enemy ships to the coast and the low cloud base out to sea, the pilots were ordered to make independent low-level attacks on any transport they could find and to report promptly what enemy forces they sighted. Each aircraft carried 4 250-pound bombs fused for 11-second delay. The pilot of the 1st Hudson, Flight Lieutenant Lockwood, on making his approach at 2,000 feet, sighted the 3 transports and dived to 50 feet to release 2 bombs. No hits were observed. As his attack drew heavy fire from the ships, he took evasive action and again flew in and released his remaining 2 bombs. Flight Lieutenant Ramshaw, who followed Lockwood into the attack, confirmed that Lockwood's second salvo had scored direct hits on the vessel amidship. From the first 7 sorties, 1 Hudson, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Jones, did not return. Several other aircraft returned, holed by the anti-aircraft fire, which was both heavy and accurate. 22-year-old Flight Lieutenant Oscar Diamond from Geelong flew in at mast height for a second run at a Japanese transport. He hit the Japanese transport, the Awagasan Maru, amidships. The Awagasan was carrying tanks and artillery and had to be abandoned by the Japanese. Another vessel, the Ayatosan Maru, was also hit and caught fire, but was later salvaged. Bombs from the Australian Hudsons also exploded amongst landing barges as they tried to ferry troops from the transport to the beaches. 2 Hudsons were shot down and most of the others incurred some damage from anti-aircraft fire. By mid-morning on the first day, the Japanese started to hit back with their own air forces. They commenced with an attack on Kota Baru airfield with Navy Zero and Army NATE or KI-27 fighters. An RAF fighter squadron, 21 Squadron, at Sungai Petani airfield was caught on the ground at 10:45 a.m. on the same day and had all but 4 of its Brewster Buffalo fighter aircraft destroyed. By late afternoon, the Japanese Army had reached Kotoburu airfield, and what remained of No. 1 Squadron was ordered to evacuate south to Kuantan airfield. By the end of the first day, the defenders had lost approximately half their air strength and had moved to alternate fields to the south, Kuantan, and the west of the point of invasion, that is Butterworth airfield. The loss of Sungai Petani airfield allowed the Japanese to press home attacks onto Kuantan and Butterworth. By the afternoon of the second day, the 9th of December, 1 and 8 Squadrons RAF were ordered to withdraw to Singapore. 21 Squadron had already withdrawn to Butterworth and was caught up in a Japanese air raid on the airfield while still airborne. It is claimed that during this engagement, Flying Officer Harold Montefiore of 21 Squadron gained the unusual distinction of shooting down a Japanese Zero with his Brewster Buffalo. However, he in turn was shot down over Butterworth and had to bail out. So by the end of the second day, the defending air forces were further reduced. The decline of the air forces can be seen by the quick demise of 453 Squadron RAF. On the 8th of December, it had 16 Brewster Buffalo fighters. Although losing aircraft, some of these were made up for with replacement aircraft. Despite this, in approximately 2 weeks, by the 24th of December, 453 Squadron had 3 operational aircraft left. It withdrew to Singapore and merged with 21 Squadron RAF. The Brewster Buffalo aircraft was a main fighter flown by the RAF, RAF and RNZAF in the defence of Malaya. It was an aircraft manufactured for the USA Navy, but modified to British requirements. It was sent to Malaya in numbers because it was considered unfit for European service for performance reasons. The aircraft, despite its performance problems, was very roughly comparable to the Japanese Army Nate and Oscar fighters, but very clearly outclassed by the Japanese Navy Zero fighter. As Jay Rickard has pointed out, the Buffalo was not the only problem faced by the air forces in Malaya. They were short of pilots. Indeed, many had more aircraft than pilots to fly them, and the pilots they did have were inexperienced. 20 of the original Buffaloes sent to the Far East were lost in training accidents during 1941 alone. At least 60 Buffalo Brewsters were shot down, another 40 destroyed on the ground, and 20 more destroyed in accidents before the Malayan campaign was over. The last gasp for the air forces in Malaya was probably the operation to intercept a small Japanese amphibious landing on the Malayan coast at Endau. Oscar Diamond from No. 1 Squadron RAF, who sank the Japanese transport off Kotoburu, detected the landing forces on the 26th of January 1942, 32 kilometres northeast of Endau. The Japanese jammed his radios and attacked his Hudson bomber with 3 fighters. Amazingly, the Hudson fought off the attacks and made it back to Singapore. Air Vice Marshal Pulford, in charge of all Air Force units in Malaya, decided to throw everything he had at the landing force. This included using the Hudsons of No. 1 and 8 Squadrons with Buffaloes from the now combined 21 and 453 Squadrons participating as fighter cover. RAF aircraft included obsolete biplane torpedo bombers such as Wildebeests with a top speed of only 140 miles per hour. The RAF and RAF squadrons conducted 4 raids on the landing force, but without sinking or seriously damaging any of the vessels. Some 15 aircraft were shot down and in excess of 30 men lost. The raids on Endau left the RAF and RAF a spent force. By early February, all RAF squadrons were out of Malaya. It has been claimed that the RAF alone destroyed more than 20 Japanese aircraft, and they definitely destroyed 1 Japanese troop ship. But this was a far cry from the aspirations of the Air Force commanders. some of whom believed that the air forces would be able to blunt a Japanese invasion by reducing the invading force by as much as 40%. This, unfortunately, did not happen. But the RAAF, RNZAF, and RAF were seriously outmatched in Malaya, the Japanese having more than twice the number of aircraft, more experienced and better trained pilots, and in large part, better aircraft. The naval battle. Singapore was intended to be a fleet base from which the British Navy could take on Japan at sea. However, by December 1941, the Royal Navy in the Far East was a shadow of its Japanese counterpart. Despite the Japanese Navy's presence in the Pacific Ocean being vastly superior to that of the Royal Navy, locally, for the Malayan campaign, the two naval forces were surprisingly well matched. They had not dissimilar numbers of cruisers and destroyers, and the major difference appeared to be in submarines. However, the Japanese had one strong advantage, and that was a powerful land-based naval aviation force. Despite this, the newly appointed commander of the British Eastern Fleet, Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, was determined to make a contribution to the defence of Malaya. At 5:30 p.m. on the evening of the first day of hostilities, Admiral Phillips took his battleship, HMS Prince of Wales, and battlecruiser, HMS Repulse, and 4 destroyers to intercept landing forces off the coast of Malaya. This force was to be known as Force Z. One of the destroyers was HMAS Vampire, a somewhat ageing First World War destroyer commanded by Commander William Moran, a West Australian from Kalgoorlie and a career sailor. Moran joined the RAN in 1917, the same year that Vampire was launched. He was an experienced sailor and had recently served in the Mediterranean on board HMAS Canberra. He was assigned to Vampire, his first command, in October 1941, just 2 months before joining Force Z. Admiral Phillips' foray proved fruitless, and when he realised his task force had probably been located by the Japanese, he decided to return to Singapore. However, by late morning on the 10th of December, he was still at sea and was found by Japanese bombers. More than 80 attacking aircraft concentrated on the big ships and left Vampire and the other destroyers alone. Some 49 torpedoes were launched against them, of which 8 eventually found their target. 2 hours after the attack began, both of the big ships, Repulse and Prince of Wales, had been sunk with the loss of 840 lives. HMAS Vampire, still unscathed, searched for survivors and rescued 225, which she took back to Singapore. It would be more than a month before Vampire's next significant action in Singapore. However, this did not mean that she and other Royal Australian Navy ships were not busy during the Malaya campaign. A hidden but critical part of Australia's Pacific War was the need to move and supply forces by sea. The defence of Malaya and Singapore were no exception. From Christmas Day 1941 until just before the fall of Singapore in mid-February 1942, more than 8 million tonnes of shipping were escorted to Singapore. Convoys leaving from Bombay, Durban and Melbourne carried more than 42,000 troops and their weapons and stores. This included ammunition, trucks, artillery and anti-aircraft guns. It even included 15 Hurricane fighters and 24 experienced pilots, albeit too late in the campaign to really have an effect. The Royal Australian Navy was a key participant in these convoys. 9 Royal Australian Navy warships were involved in escort duties and represented about 20% of the total convoy escort days. HMAS Vampire was the common Australian naval thread that ran throughout the Malayan campaign. Her last significant duty was to attack the Japanese invasion force at Endau. As you will remember, it was also the last significant duty of the air forces in Malaya. Vampire, in the company of the British destroyer HMS Thanet, made for Endau from Singapore on the afternoon of the 25th of January 1942. It was an unequal task. The 2 destroyers were against an invasion screening force of 1 Japanese cruiser and 6 destroyers. As one writer has pointed out, the Japanese would have 35 5-inch naval guns against 7 4-inch on the Vampire and the Thanet. At approximately 2 a.m, the destroyers reached the vicinity of the invasion force and searched for transports. A little after 3 a.m, without having found the transport, both Vampire and Thanet were engaged by a Japanese destroyer and then a cruiser. By 4 a.m, the Thanet was mortally hit and some 15 minutes later sank. Vampire, unscathed, made it back to Singapore. After the action near Endau, convoy duties were to take Vampire away from Malaya and ultimately to Ceylon, or what is now called Sri Lanka. Some 2 months later, while escorting the aircraft carrier HMAS Hermes, she was attacked and sunk by Japanese aircraft. Commander Moran and 7 of his crew did not survive the attack. The price paid by the Royal Navy for the defence of Malaya was high. HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse were the first capital ships to be sunk while under sail by aircraft alone. Some 840 sailors lost their lives. Although the convoy work was critical to the sustainment of forces in Malaya, meaningful naval opposition to the Japanese in Malaya ceased to exist less than a week after hostilities began. Neither the Royal Navy nor the Royal Australian Navy provided credible opposition to the Japanese Navy. As an interesting aside, the Dutch Navy, with only 4 submarines, sank or damaged more Japanese shipping around Malaya and Thailand than did the Royal Navy, Royal Australian Navy, RAF or RAAF. However, this was not enough to halt the Japanese advance, and the submarines paid a heavy price for their actions.